Hello, this is a lecture in Bruce Baker's series on the history of New Orleans. Today's topic is New Orleans in the French Empire. So we'll start as an overview with just asking what role Louisiana as a colony played in the imperial systems and struggles of the 18th century. The significance of this is that once we understand Louisiana within this broad imperial context, we'll begin to understand why it came into American hands at the beginning of the 19th century, which was tied up with the transitions and decays of various imperial powers in the New World, in North America and the Caribbean. And I would say the main idea for this is that France's goals for New Orleans and Louisiana turned out to be a lot harder to achieve than they had hoped in the 40 years after the city was founded in 1718. And by the time of the 7 Years' War, they were fairly glad to get rid of it and let it fall into the hands of Spain. So, just to mention, obviously, this area of history is something that I'm drawing on the works of a number of other scholars. You can find the particular books that I'm relying on and articles and so forth in the webpage accompanying this, which should be below in the comments. Particularly, though, I would recommend Lawrence Powell's book, The Accidental City, which is an excellent and tremendously readable overview of early New Orleans, and is really, to be honest, the source of quite a lot of what I'm drawing on here. So, if we think about French rule of Louisiana, France had economic goals for New Orleans to create a system rather like what they had in Saint-Domingue, which was exporting lots of sugar and making lots of money. In this case, though, they wanted Louisiana to become an exporter of tobacco, because in the early 18th century, the demand for tobacco increased tremendously in France. However, the problem that they ran into there was that the supply of tobacco came from the Chesapeake colonies of England. So they wanted to find their own source, and for more on this, have a look back on the webpage to the link to the video by Tom Ritchie about mercantilism, which explains the economic background for all of this. I won't do that here. So the problem is that tobacco comes from England's Chesapeake colonies, and France wants its own colony. They did a series of experiments with tobacco at several sites around the Gulf Coast, and a man named Antoine Crozat, who had the rights to distribute tobacco, managed to convince the Crown that Louisiana was the place to choose, that Louisiana could grow tobacco in quality and quantity to equal the Chesapeake, and to therefore displace that English source of tobacco with a French source. So, the decision to make Louisiana a tobacco colony meant that they needed to introduce enslaved labor. And so about 6,000 enslaved laborers were brought from Africa and from other colonies in the Caribbean to Louisiana before 1731. So from the time of settlement, 1718 until 1731, you had a sudden inrush of enslaved laborers. The enslaved men were sent to the plantations surrounding New Orleans, and very few were sent to the city itself. However, it's important to remember that the plantation system, just how it laid out on the land in Louisiana, is rather different to what we're accustomed to if we're thinking about Virginia and the Chesapeake. In Virginia, the plantations were dispersed sort of evenly, more or less evenly over the landscape. They did tend to cluster near rivers for transport, but the difference in Louisiana is that they divided the riverfront, which was essentially your transport route, divided the riverfront into small pieces with long stretches of land running back from the riverfront into swamps and forest and whatever was back there. So you had a very different pattern. If you look at maps and so forth, you'll see how this lays out. However, there's a significant difference to how the enslaved population built up in Louisiana as opposed to Chesapeake and also the Carolina colonies, so the English colonies. In those colonies, we see this perhaps more notably in the Chesapeake, but we can say the same thing really in the early days of the Carolina colony. They established a colony and then tried to figure out how to make money from it. So in Virginia, they cast around for a few years and finally figure out tobacco. That's going to be the thing. In Carolina colony, which isn't divided into North Carolina and South Carolina until a few years into the 18th century. But there, similarly, they sort of established the colony, have this land, cast about, trying to figure out what to do with it, and eventually, towards the very tail end of the 17th century, they hit on rice and realized that rice is going to work there. Louisiana is rather different, and they established the colony effectively in order to produce tobacco. So what this means is that in Carolina and Chesapeake, so counting Maryland and Virginia in the same cluster there of the Chesapeake, there they develop an economic need for labor and then eventually fill that need with enslaved labor, right? So that's why we don't have enslaved laborers turning up in Virginia until 1619, a few years after everything is established. Louisiana is very different in that they bring the slaves in first. The problem with this, or what this means, is that because tobacco production, so tobacco prices had soared at the end of the 17th century, and that's what sort of drove the shift to tobacco cultivation in Virginia and then drove them to bring in enslaved laborers. And when France sets up Louisiana, and they already know what they're going to do, they're going to raise lots of tobacco, but however, it doesn't work out so well. So the tobacco production, just for various reasons, we can read into it in more detail, but tobacco production just doesn't take off in the same way. But the problem is that they already have imported these 6,000 enslaved laborers. So rather differently, Louisiana begins with a large concentration of enslaved African origin labor, as opposed to Carolina and Virginia, which don't really start out with that same density of enslaved labor. So the labor supply is diverted into other things like public works, like growing rice for local consumption. Enslaved laborers turn to becoming artisans, such as carpenters and blacksmiths and that sort of thing. So if we come back to the reasons why tobacco never really worked in Louisiana, it was essentially because those in charge in France, essentially, would not set the price high enough to make the cultivation of tobacco worthwhile for the people in Louisiana doing the work and investing the money and so forth. French shippers charged freight rates that were far too high, so that even if you could grow a good crop, by the time you paid the money to get it to France, and of course remembering with mercantilism, you can only send it back to France. So by the time you had paid the freight to get it to France, you had lost money on it. Also, as it turns out, the weather of South Louisiana is rather different to the weather and the climate and the soil and so forth in Virginia, and it just doesn't work as well for tobacco. I'm sure that if we read in detail agricultural science things, we could understand why, but take my word for it, the weather doesn't suit tobacco as well as they had thought it might. And so if we look ahead a number of years, so by 1763, Paris is essentially ready to give up on tobacco. It sort of flounders around for quite a while. So this creates a number of problems with French rule next slide. So this is not going to be a seamless thing, but it's pretty good. So right from the beginning, New Orleans has problems. Maybe we can almost think of that as a theme of New Orleans history, with a few sort of brief exceptions, perhaps. And one of the problems that it has is actually political, and that's a problem of factionalism centering around Bienville, the governor, the leader of New Orleans, who is doing favors for his friends in terms of allocating resources, especially things like land, sort of assigning who can have which plantations in which favorable places, and also the allocation of the import of slave labor. So you couldn't just buy slaves as they came in. That was tightly controlled by Bienville, and that allows him to sort of establish a faction that supports him, people who aren't favored, oppose him, and so forth. There was also the problem that Bienville basically, to some extent, did as he pleased. A lot of his judgments were fairly good. They were sort of on-the-ground judgments, but he didn't necessarily follow the orders that his superiors in Paris sent. And this meant that when they found out, they then sent people in to try to sort things out and get him to follow orders. And again, this creates further factionalism. People who support Bienville and people who sometimes for material reasons about land and slave distribution, as I was saying, or perhaps just political opportunity, sort of fall into the faction opposing him. There's also a problem in New Orleans, nobody will be surprised to hear about this, about just sort of general disorder. So early on, there was, in order to populate France, aside from the 6,000 enslaved laborers who were obviously victims of forced immigration, France used a system of forced immigration of French settlers. And this included convicts who were sort of grabbed out of the prisons of France, put on a ship, and sent to New Orleans, which they may or may not have been too happy about. They would sweep the streets of prostitutes and petty criminals and throw them on a ship and say, guess what, you get to live in New Orleans. This probably is not going to create a population of people who are enthusiastic and gung-ho and who have planned for a future in the New World and so forth. There are also, excuse me, there are also, unsurprisingly again, a lot of taverns, which, as we know, really sort of throughout the history of the antebellum period and enslaved life in North America, whether it's Louisiana or Virginia or Tennessee or wherever, taverns become a center where you have illicit commerce between enslaved people and free people. And so in this case, you have enslaved people sort of exchanging goods that they've acquired somehow for food and drink, things like that. New Orleans has a lot of gambling houses, it has brothels, and a lot of these are concentrating at the back of town, so at sort of the back ends of where things are settled. So this becomes, if we think forward, really through the beginning of the 20th century, as the back of town, that is to say the land behind the French border all the way back to Lake Pontchartrain, is that eventually in the early 20th century is drained and built on. But it's the less good land, it's further away from the river, it's further away from it's further away from the kind of controls of the city and so forth. So it tends to be all the way up through sort of the early 20th century. There's also a lecture in the series about Robert Charles in 1900, and that obviously takes place in the back of city area. So that's a sort of general area of disorder. There's soldiers, that's good. They're there to sort of keep order and police things, but they actually sort of become part of the problem, running some of these taverns that are causing the disorder. There's also, early on in New Orleans, a special clinic set up specifically for sailors and men who are in the Navy who have sexually transmitted infections. So you just sort of have problems of general disorder in New Orleans. There's also a problem of smuggling. And in this period, an average of about 1/3 of Louisiana's annual exports were deer skins. And you can read elsewhere about why deer skins and the deerskin trade was very important to Europe. But this emphasis on deer skins in the early period, because remember, tobacco is not really working out, people are trying to find other ways to make money. This encourages a sort of dispersed settlement and also encourages close relations with Native Americans because they're the ones hunting and acquiring the deer skins and then trading to French settlers who are then sending them on back to Europe. So there's a lot of trade and barter in a lot of cases, and that becomes very difficult for the authorities to monitor and regulate. There's lots of trading along the river of wheat and other food for French imported goods. So again, if we think about the sort of overall economic framework of this, all trade is supposed to be documented and controlled by the authorities and so all this sort of thing. And what we've got here is a lot of informal trades popping up, deer skins, informal trading of wheat for French imported goods and things like that, partly because the fundamental economic driver of the economy, tobacco production, simply isn't working out. A lot of shipping people in France begin to realize that it just doesn't pay to make that extra journey all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi River and up the Mississippi River. And so they begin really only trading with the colony at Saint-Domingue. So if you're in Louisiana, you have to reship things from Saint-Domingue onto New Orleans. So we have problems with shipping. This adds essentially another layer of middlemen and more costs. So rather than shipping something straight from France to Louisiana, you ship it to Saint-Domingue, and then somebody else has to ship it, and they take a little cut as well. So prices go up. The value of what you get for the products that you're sending back decreases. And so there's a lot of smuggling to avoid paying customs at the customs post on the river, near, not at, but near the mouth of the river downstream. And everybody in New Orleans, effectively, from the top officials right on down, is involved in smuggling. So we have these sort of general problems of disorder. We have political factionalism. We have all sorts of sort of whatever you could call criminal, social, civic disorder. And we have the sort of economic effects of disorder, of sort of mercantilism gone bad leads to massive smuggling. And that sort of further exacerbates all these other problems. If you think about the way that economic factor encourages dispersed settlement, encourages further informal trade, etc. And I really like the way that Lawrence Powell sort of phrases this, which is that in New Orleans, in the 18th century, we have a sort of mercantilism in reverse. So they're consuming more imports, things like wine and cloth and other finished products, than it could be paid for by their exports of tobacco, indigo, and lumber. And this, within the broader sort of imperial structure and sort of the whole purpose of having colonies, undermines that because, as Powell says, nation states were supposed to drain bullion away from imperial rivals. But the bootleg activity that was swelling into exuberant maturity as New Orleans entered its second generation not only defied state policy, it was condemning mercantilism to death by 1,000 cuts. And then we get into a situation where there are these problems with how the colony is functioning. France is essentially looking for an opportunity to offload it. And fortunately, they get that opportunity in the 7 Years' War and its aftermath. So the 7 Years' War, remember, is 1756 to 1763. And it's often thought of as sort of the first global conflict of the modern era. In the United States, it's often referred to as the French and Indian War, but actually it starts in North America, but it later involves the Caribbean, it involves India, and it involves the Philippines. It's mostly England versus France, but it does draw in other European nations. I won't get into the details, but importantly here, this includes Spain on France's side. The gist of it is, not to put too fine a point on it, England wins. They basically get the rest of New France, and they also get Florida. Importantly here, Spain, they got Cuba and the Philippines back from England. England had seized Cuba and the Philippines during the war. And in the settlement that brings the peace in 1763, Spain gets that back. And King Charles III of Spain really wants to try to get better control over this very far-flung empire. Remember that the Spanish Empire has kind of seen its day, and it's in decline for all sorts of reasons, which if this were history of the Spanish Empire, we would go into in more detail. But Charles III decides, right, need to get control of things better. And he gets Louisiana from France in 1762 during the war as sort of a thank you for helping out with the war. And this is important because this means that France is effectively losing its possessions in New France. So the bits around the Great Lakes, the bits that are Canada, now means that if you think about the geopolitics of it and the map, France no longer really needs Louisiana to sort of link the provinces in Canada with the Caribbean. So France is reasonably happy to get rid of it at that point. And that is going to wrap up this lecture.